shall not be infringed. Apparently, shall not be absolute. Hello, free citizens. This is John Strand bringing you the latest Frontline Flash. Constitutional experts are weighing in on Joe Biden's recent remarks as he called for even further restrictions on the Second Amendment. In the wake of the Nashville school shooting, where a disturbed lunatic killed 6 people, including 3 children, Biden's comments dutifully matched the Democrat Party's robotic response to gun-related crimes, putting focus on the guns instead of the criminals wielding them. In this case, the shooter was a woman who was being treated for an undisclosed emotional disorder, perhaps related to her claim that she was a man. She came to the Christian private school with 2 rifles and a handgun, which she had purchased legally, skipping another school with stronger security in favor of this one, where she knew there were no armed citizens. In response, Biden said he wants you to know who isn't supporting gun control, quote, to put pressure on them, end quote, and then fired off this diatribe. Everybody thinks somehow the Second Amendment is absolute. You're not allowed to go out and own an automatic weapon. You're not allowed to own a machine gun. You're not allowed to own a flamethrower. You're not allowed to own so many other things. Why in God's name do we allow these weapons in our streets and on our schools? Meanwhile, in Tennessee, where the school shooting occurred, weapons are not legally permitted at schools for non-staff. But for some reason, the shooter decided to ignore that law. And Biden seems to ignore the fact that 0 school shooting deaths have occurred at schools with armed guards present, as Congressman Thomas Massie just pointed out. Biden also ignored the astounding falsity of his entire tirade against numerous weapons, all of which are in fact allowed, in certain circumstances, in almost every state. Constitutional scholar and UCLA law professor Eugene Bullock told Frontline News it is true that, quote, the Second Amendment doesn't protect all people's ability to keep and bear all arms in all places. The Supreme Court has told us that it doesn't protect, for instance, felons or the possession of guns in certain sensitive places, such as courthouses or schools, said Professor Bullock. But the violation comes when the government restricts gun rights arbitrarily, perhaps including a recent push to raise the minimum purchasing age from 18 to 21, while of course not also changing the minimum age for drafted military service. This government wants to take away your right to own a gun, but they also still retain the right to force you into dying in foreign wars to fund their military-industrial complex. Call it a conspiracy theory if you must, but we imagine the Founding Fathers would have a problem with this. Professor Bullock also added, quote, if it means that the government can just restrict the right to keep and bear arms whenever it thinks that, on balance, restricting it is a good idea, that's not right, end quote. Adding that the Supreme Court expressly rejected this notion in a recent decision, New York Rifle Association Inc. versus Bruin last year. Guy Smith, a Second Amendment researcher and founder of gunfacts.info, explains that the Second Amendment, like any God-given right, is absolute, unless the government can prove through due process that an individual should not retain the right. Quote, the Constitution also allows disabling any right to an individual, but not the public at large, and only after due process, which is the chain of criminal charges, representation by counsel, trial by jury, and conviction, Smith stated. He added that any restriction of civil rights must address a, quote, compelling government interest, and be very narrowly tailored to achieve that interest, end quote. Ironically, the Second Amendment, rather than a guarantee of self-defense against criminals, was intended as a bulwark against a tyrannical government. This would include, ostensibly, governments who seek to confiscate guns from their citizens. We would suggest that tyranny shall not be tolerated. Ladies and gentlemen, the real story of right now continues, coming soon on the next Frontline Flash.